I wanted to do an experiment with 35mm to try to get the most optimal results. I chose to use Tmax 400 because it's the sharpest and finest grained film that you can get in 400 speed. For this experiment, I'm pretty much comparing non-solvent to solvent developers, and for the solvent developer, I'm using Xtol 1:2, but that's going to represent like D76 or others. For the non-solvent developer, I'm using HC110, and I just went with the regular dilution B on this one. When I saw the results, I was actually a little bit surprised. I went with Xtol 1:2 because the more you dilute it, the sharper it gets, and I felt like that was a better comparison when putting it next to an AccuTints developer like HC110. Surprisingly, the grain is not too different from one another. The HC110 grain is definitely larger and more visible, but it's not as bad as I thought it was going to be. The main difference between the two was that the HC110 version was way more overdeveloped. The T-grain films are a lot more sensitive to development than conventional films are. It seemed like the Xtol version gave a lot more latitude in the highlights than the HC110 version did. When I was shooting the photos for these, I wanted to compare the sharpness between the two, and of course it's not fair to compare an AccuTints developer's sharpness to a solvent developer's sharpness, but I think with Xtol at 1:2, it's plenty sharp enough to be a good rival to the sharpness of the HC110. T-grain films are about 30% more sensitive to development than conventional films are, and it definitely shows when you're comparing two different developers. When you dilute Xtol between 1:1 and 1:3, it ends up with a lot more highlight latitude. Especially with the T-grain film, it's a lot more important because, as you can see, the T-grain films are easily overdeveloped. Just with the normal dilution of dilution B for HC110, the highlights were way more dense than the Xtol version. Of course, you can work with that and develop it less, but just with no adjustments, I ended up liking the Xtol version way more. I shot both of these at the normal box speed of 400, and of course the dilutions were different, but the results were drastically different between the two. And you could definitely work with the HC110 dilution and fine-tune that development time to get some better highlight latitude, but with the results from the Xtol between the comparable sharpness and the much finer grain, I would say that I think the Xtol at 1:2 is the optimal developer and dilution for a 35mm film. If you're after more of a gritty look, of course that's fine too. You don't have to always go with the finer grain. I've heard people make the complaint that Tmax films look too digital, but I think with 35mm that's not really an issue because it's a small enough format so that no matter what, it's always going to have a little bit of grit and kind of lo-fi quality to it. So it all depends on what you like, but I really like the results from the 1:2 with the Xtol. So I think if I were to do a regular shoot, I would definitely use that combination again. Thank you guys for watching, and we'll see you guys next time on The Negative.